Well, guys, thank you so much for watching Samba Around Town. I just received it today. Um, yeah, I just received it today. Here it is. It's Chicken in the Bus, More Thought on Cultural Differences by the greatest of all, Joseph Mbele. Joseph Mbele, in this book, Chicken in the Bus, is really talking about things that happen in our lifetime and continue to happen in that forgotten world, Africa. This is a very great book that this renowned scholar, Joseph L. Mbele, who's an African immigrant from Tanzania, and also is a renowned professor here in the US in the English department at the St. Olive College, right here in Northfield, Minnesota. Like he previously taught in at the University of Dar es Salaam in Africa, and he has been definitely doing a lot of work for us. In this very latest and greatest book, Chicken in the Bus, which I encourage all the people who had really been involved with SAMBA, with Multicultural Kids Network. Previously, we talked about the African and African American embracing cultural differences that he also wrote, is the author of it. We had numerous conversations about that book. This is the latest and greatest, Chicken in the Bus. Right away, get into Amazon and order this book. All its chapters mean a whole lot for me. It means a lot. That's the truth. This is something that, guys, we need to catch up with our children, whom you know here in the state of Minnesota, they're all behind grade level with regards to reading and math. This is the answer. I love all the chapters of it. One of which the professor related about my life, and that's why I love chapter number 8. If you go to the content, it says chapter number 9, but in reality, inside that's chapter number 8. Another trick that African does, it's not a mistake. It's a way to get you to open up that mentality, because we sometimes are robotized. This one will make you believe, oh, that's a chapter 8. Oh, what does it say? So that you can go back and read all the contents, because in the contents, he has cultural differences in the global village we are in now. He also have, do you have an accent like Samba when he speaks? Do you have an accent? What does he talk about? That's another chapter to read. African time. Multicultural Kids Network does that all the time. The professor puts it in a very straightforward way. Chicken in the Bus. That's my favorite. Trouble over loud music in Brooklyn Park. I totally understand. So we'll be going through each of these chapters and make a short video for you guys. But for today, being African in America, chapter 8, that's what I would like to read for my children, for my friends, for my people, for you guys. Being African in America, especially me, Samba. I want to talk to you guys. Being African in America. Being an African in America is tricky. Here I'm talking about Africans with my skin color. You get lost among African Americans and people who assume you are an African American. You find yourself called by the names African Americans call themselves, which have been changed over the years. A common label nowadays is people of color. I have often told Americans that I am not a person of color, only to encounter puzzlements over even mild shock. What did you hear what he said? At a faith-based conference in Davenport, Iowa, some African American pastors at our lunch table asked me directly, "What do you say what do you say? You are not a person of color? No, actually, why do you say you are not a person of color? I try to explain that Africans like me grow up without any awareness of the color of our skin. We think about our skin only when it's necessary to do so, such as when it itches, because we are basically oblivious to the color of our skin. We do not define or identify ourselves in terms of skin color. If you ask an African to identify themselves, they will use ethnic categories like Zulu, Wolof, or Kamba. Otherwise, they will identify themselves by nations such as South Africa, or I'm a South African, or Senegalese, or Zambian. They may simply say they are African. They are not going to say they are Black people or people of color. If you come by my home region and talk about people of color, nobody would understand you. They may think you are talking about the occasional white person they see, who might be a priest, a doctor, a volunteer, or a tourist. Various Africans, such as Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, have stated that it is only when they come to America that they learn they are Black. How can it be otherwise? All people have the right to name and identify themselves. Naming is a political act, a form of exercising power. Naming oneself is self-affirmation and self-empowerment. Naming others can be an act of control and domination. The colonizer in Africa and elsewhere described as colonizers using derogatory and disparaging terms such as primitive, backward, uncivilized, earthen, and adverse psychological consequences for the colonized. Such is the power that naming bears. Whoa, that's powerful. Guys, I'm gonna read back that paragraph. Oof. The professor goes back and says, all people have the right to name and identify themselves. Naming is a political act, a form of exercising power. Naming oneself is self-affirmation and self-empowerment. Naming others can be an act of control and domination. The colonizers in Africa and elsewhere describes the colonized using derogatory and disparaging terms such as primitive, backward, uncivilized, earthen, with adverse psychological consequences to be colonized. Such is the power of naming. Such is the power that naming bears. For Africans to label themselves or to be labeled as people, as person of color, raise some issues. I wonder if such Africans really feel and understand and believe they are people of color. since they arrive in the US knowing they are Yoruba, Somalis, or just African. They do not have the mindset and sensibilities of Americans who coin and use the label people of color. Africans are not programmed to see things with a racial lens the way African Americans and Americans in general see themselves. If, for instance, something happens that American sees as racist, African may not see that way. I read a report from Rochester, Minnesota about troubles in the schools, which involves Somali students and American students. The American reporter interviewing Somali parents assumed that they would attribute the problem to racism. But the Somali parents said the problem were due to cultural differences. As products of different histories, Africans are different from African American. Africans are not descendants of slaves. They did not grow up with the stories of slavery. The Underground Railroad or civil rights struggles, they do not carry the trauma of that legacy. Nor do they carry what James Baldwin described as the rage of African Americans. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a stage of rage almost all of the time. And in one's work, and part of the rage is this: it isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you and all the time in the face of the most extraordinary and criminal indifferences of most white people in this country and their ignorance. Africans are not in a stage of rage. They come to America with dreams and determination to achieve them. Some come from troubled countries, and the troublemaker are African like themselves. If anything, Africans tend to have a positive view of white people. As I say in my book, African and Americans Embracing Cultural Differences, a very great book. What should we do? We need education. Africans need to understand where the African American come from, and vice versa. As matters are, there is much ignorance on both sides, and this fuels misunderstandings and conflict. Africans in America should understand and be sensitive to the history and predicament of African Americans. But they do not pretend to be African. But they should not pretend to be African Americans. They should be themselves. African Americans should not assume that Africans can be like them. Africans may encounter racial discrimination, but they do not and cannot contextualize and understand it the way African Americans do. In response to these arguments, African Americans point out that America, let me repeat, I'm sorry. In response to these arguments, African Americans point out that in America, a Black person is just a Black person. They say that when the police stops a Black person, they do not care whether you are from Africa or Alabama. You are just a Black person. My response is that I alone have the right to defend myself. I have not surrendered that right to the police or anyone else. What people think about me neither determine nor change my identity. I know who I am. Will my African identity and sensibility evolve into something else? I do not see any sign that that's happening. I do not see any sign of that happening. Children born of African parents in America have a better chance of seeing themselves as Americans or African American than those of us who were born and raised in Africa. We should acknowledge that the fact and leave it. We should acknowledge that fact and live with it. This is a very, very powerful chapter. It is. I would recommend people to really buy this book and learn, because it carries on a lot of real truth, especially those of us from my continent of Africa who are today the US citizen. We are today the naturalized US citizen. This country needs you. And by reading this book, yeah, you might definitely make your dream come true. You definitely would be worthwhile reconsidering why you are here. You are here to make a difference in our life, in the American lives, but also in the entire world. Joseph MBele, Chicken in the Bus. And yes, we'll come back to another chapter reading you Chicken in the Bus. Again, this is Samba Around Town. This is a very, very powerful way to end my week. Thank you so much, Professor MBele.